Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
It's one thing to hear about murder. It's another to watch the killer explain it himself.
Oh, you're a serial killer!
Killing wasn't the objective. I just wanted to have the person under my complete control.
These death row confessions show what happens when guilt is caught on tape.
Why do you want to be executed?
I have to be.
Saw you, reached out to say.
Anything happened, I can guarantee I'd do it again, and sooner or later I would kill another child.
A predator listing victims like chores. A racist gunman calling murder his duty. A man claiming his crimes were sacrifices.
Those are two young boys, just 13 and 14 years old. Why did you shoot them?
This is what God wanted me to do.
These are the 10 most disturbing death row confessions ever caught on camera.
How many people have you killed?
Lord, I don't know.
10?
Yeah.
20?
Probably.
50?
I know it's been a lot.
Number 10. Danny Rowling, the killer who sang about death. Danny Rowling's rampage in Gainesville lasted only a few days, but it was enough to freeze an entire college town. In late August of 1990, he broke into student apartments near the University of Florida and killed 5 people over 4 days, 4 young women and 1 man. The attacks were brutal. Victims were stabbed with a large knife, some were sexually assaulted, and several were left in staged, shocking poses. News of the killing spread fast. Students slept in groups, parents rushed in to pull their children out of town, and thousands fled campus in fear. For months, nobody knew who was doing it. Police chased hundreds of leads, took blood samples from dozens of men, and still had no name. What they did not realize was that Rowling was already behind bars. Weeks after the murders, he had been arrested for robbing a grocery store in Ocala. When investigators dug deeper into that case, they found a campsite in the woods near Gainesville. There, they recovered a tent, tools, and a small pile of evidence, including a tape player, cassette tapes, and a bag that held the same kind of knife used in the murders. DNA taken from Rowling matched the Gainesville crime scenes, and the link was finally made. In 1994, Rowling walked into a Florida courtroom, surprised everyone, and pleaded guilty to all 5 student murders, just as his trial was about to begin. The judge later sentenced him to death for each killing. From that point on, he lived under a death warrant at Florida State Prison, waiting through years of appeals while the details of what he had done were picked apart in court. Only then did people start to hear his own voice. During the penalty phase, prosecutors played recordings he had made himself, cassette tapes found at his campsite. On them, Rowling talked about stalking, control, and wanting to be remembered. He described drifting into Gainesville, pitching a tent in the woods, and setting out to become a superstar among criminals. Later, from death row, Rowling tried to shape how people saw him. In a letter to the Associated Press, he insisted he wasn't the monster everyone imagined, writing that he was not a salivating ogre. He also said he felt like 2 different people fighting inside him, explaining that a good side and violent side were battling back and forth, and that this inner conflict was pushing him toward insanity. He also talked about the execution waiting for him. Rowling said he knew he deserved the punishment, but he didn't pretend to be brave about it. He admitted he didn't want to die, and letting go of life was far harder than he expected. Before the end, Rowling added one more confession. In a handwritten note given to his spiritual advisor and turned over to police, he admitted killing Tom Grissom, his daughter Julie, and 8-year-old Sean Grissom in Shreveport, Louisiana, a year before the Gainesville murders. On Death Day in October of 2006, witnesses filled the viewing room at Florida State Prison. Reporters, relatives of the students, and members of the Shreveport family all stood behind the glass. When officers asked if he had any last words, Rowling did not give a speech. Instead, strapped to the gurney with IV lines already in his arms, he began to sing a soft, hymn-like song as his final statement.
I recall the day I first saw you. I reached out to say I love you.
None greater than thee, O Lord, none greater than thee. He kept singing even after the microphone was cut. The drugs flowed, his voice faded, and he was pronounced dead by lethal injection a few minutes later. Number 9. Aileen Wuornos, the woman who hunted men. Aileen Wuornos' story runs straight down the highways of Florida. Over about a year, she hitchhiked along the roads while men in passing cars picked her up, thinking she just needed a ride. Some of those men never made it back home. She shot and robbed 7 men, then left their cars behind on the side of the road and kept moving, drifting from place to place like nothing had happened. Police finally caught up with her after a car crash linked her to stolen property from one of the victims. Investigators began to pull on that thread and found more. With help from her girlfriend, they connected scenes across the state and built a case that showed a clear pattern. The same drifter, the same kind of victim, the same kind of killing. During questioning, Wuornos told detectives that the first man she killed had attacked her and that she acted in self-defense. She said every killing after that came from fear that it would happen again. She talked about picking up clients, watching their hands, and reacting the moment she felt threatened. In the end, the explanation didn't save her. In Florida courts, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. While on death row in Florida, Wuornos sat in front of a camera and calmly admitted she had killed several men. At one point, she put it in simple, brutal words. "I killed those men, robbed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again too." There was no emotion, no attempt to justify anything. Just a flat acceptance that it was all over. She talked about what she had done and the anger that pushed her toward it. As her execution date came closer, her on-camera behavior became even more unsettling. In later death row interviews, she swung between calm and rage. One moment, she admitted everything. The next, she claimed the system was torturing her with something she called sonic pressure. She yelled at reporters, at the courts, and at people she said had used her. It felt raw, messy, and hard to watch. The last look at someone who knew her time was almost gone. In Florida, executions are done by lethal injection. Wuornos turned down a special last meal and asked only for a cup of coffee. On October 10, 2002, the state carried out the sentence. Her last words were as strange as the rest of her story. She said she would come back with Jesus, like in Independence Day. Number 8. Wesley Allan Dodd, the child killer who asked to die. Everything started over Labor Day weekend in 1989 in Vancouver, Washington. Wesley Allan Dodd lured 2 brothers, 11-year-old Cole Neer and 10-year-old William Neer, into the woods at David Douglas Park. Cole died there. William died on the way to the hospital. The murders devastated the community. A few weeks later, just across the river in Portland, 4-year-old Lee Iselli disappeared from a school playground. Dodd took him back to his apartment in Vancouver and killed him the next morning. He was caught because someone stepped in. In November of that same year, Dodd tried to carry a 6-year-old boy out of a movie theater in Camas. Theater employees chased him into the parking lot, and when his car stalled, a bystander put him in a headlock and held him until police arrived. Over the next 3 days, detectives questioned him. Dodd confessed to the murders, and a search of his apartment uncovered his notes, plans, and diaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and he later pleaded guilty. A national documentary crew filmed him for a public television program about sexual predators. On camera, he spoke softly about how his fantasies turned violent, how the urge to kill kept growing, and why he believed he could never stop. There was no emotion in his delivery, no attempt to defend himself, just a calm explanation of how his crimes escalated. In court, Dodd made it clear he wanted to die. He waived nearly all of his appeals and told judges that if he were ever released, he would kill again. Under Washington law, he could choose how to be executed, by lethal injection or by hanging. He chose hanging, saying it matched how he had killed his last victim. Before dawn on January 5, 1993, the state carried out the sentence at the penitentiary in Walla Walla. Dodd was hanged on the prison gallows, the first legal hanging in the United States since 1965. His last meal was broiled salmon and fried potatoes. Number 7. Joseph Paul Franklin, hate in human form. Joseph Paul Franklin turned his hatred into a cross-country shooting spree. His attacks began in the late 1970s and spread across more than 10 states. He hunted interracial couples, Jewish worshippers, and black men, choosing victims who fit his white supremacist beliefs and striking without warning. He later admitted to shooting civil rights leader Vernon Jordan and to paralyzing Hustler magazine publisher Larry Flynt because the magazine had shown a mixed-race couple in one of its photo spreads.
Well, to try to get a race war started, mixed-race couples and blacks, I figured if once I started doing it and showed them how, other white supremacists would do the same thing, follow suit.
Police and federal agents eventually caught up with him using a mix of clues: stolen cars he had used, ballistic evidence tying his guns to crime scenes, and even blood donations he made while on the run. The FBI later said that before his spree ended in 1980, Franklin had killed at least 15 people in about 11 states and claimed responsibility for several more. The case that sent him to death row centered on a synagogue shooting outside St. Louis in 1977. Hiding in the bushes near Brith Shalom Neseth, Israel, Franklin opened fire on families walking to their cars, killing Gerald Gordon and wounding 2 others. Months earlier, he had firebombed a synagogue in Chattanooga and later bragged that he was waging a one-man race war. Those attacks put him in a Missouri courtroom and ended with a death sentence that sent him to death row. From there, the cameras captured what he really thought. While on death row in Missouri, Joseph Paul Franklin sat in front of interviewers and, in a flat, almost bored tone, explained why he had spent years hunting strangers. He said he wanted to start a race war. He called the killings a mission and claimed he was doing the will of God. What makes those on-camera admissions so disturbing is not just what he says, but how he says it. He never argues, never pleads. He simply lays out his process, waiting, picking a target, pulling the trigger, and walking away, as if he were describing a routine task instead of murder. In the final 24 hours before his execution, there were last-minute legal challenges over Missouri's lethal injection method and over Franklin's mental competence. 2 federal judges briefly delayed the process, but higher courts reversed those rulings, and the Supreme Court refused to step in. Just after dawn on November 20, 2013, guards escorted him into the chamber at Bonne Terre. The state used a single dose of pentobarbital. Witnesses said Franklin declined to speak. He blinked a few times, took several heavy breaths, and then lay still. He was pronounced dead shortly after 6 in the morning. Number 6. Tommy Lynn Sells, the drifter who killed for fun. Tommy Lynn Sells drifted from town to town, leaving a trail of violence behind him. The case that finally stopped him unfolded on the last night of 1999 near Del Rio, Texas. He broke into a small house, killed 13-year-old Kayleen Katie Harris, and cut the throat of 10-year-old Crystal Searles, who somehow survived. Even though she was bleeding and barely able to breathe, Crystal made it to a neighbor's house and described what she remembered. Her courage gave police enough detail to build a sketch. Within days, officers arrested Sells. The Texas trial ended with Sells being sentenced to death, and as soon as he got to death row, investigators in other states started linking his name to old unsolved murders from years before. For a long time, he kept filing appeals and challenges, but the sentence stayed in place. Only after that did the public see him explain himself on camera. After his arrest, he did more than just admit what he had done. He went back to the Harris home and, on video, walked detectives through the crime scene step by step. In later TV interviews, when reporters asked him about his life and his killings, he did not hold back. He talked about murder the way someone else might talk about work. In one interview, he looked at the camera and said, "I am hatred. When you look at me, you look at hate. I don't know what love is." Police ultimately linked him to at least 22 murders, though Sells claimed there were many more.
2 females, and it happened in '91, close to Cabin Creek.
Some of his confessions actually helped free innocent people. In Illinois, he described a break-in that matched the killing of a young boy named Joel Kirkpatrick. The boy's mother, Julie Rhea, had been convicted of that murder, but Sells' detailed confession showed she had not done it. Other claims did not hold up, like his story about the Dardine family murders, which investigators never could fully verify. In April of 2014, after his final appeals failed, Texas executed Tommy Lynn Sells with a single dose of pentobarbital. He chose not to say anything before the injection. Witnesses said he lay still on the gurney, and within minutes, he was pronounced dead. Number 5. Dylann Roof. Cold hate inside a church. On the evening of June 17, 2015, 9 people gathered for Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. The small group welcomed a quiet young white man who walked in carrying a handgun hidden under his clothes. He sat with them for nearly an hour as they read and prayed. Then, as they bowed their heads for a final prayer, he stood up, pulled the gun, and opened fire at close range. When it was over, 9 black worshippers were dead inside one of the oldest black churches in the South. A massive manhunt followed. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and the car he used helped police identify the shooter as 21-year-old Dylann Roof. He was stopped and arrested in North Carolina the next morning. Federal agents soon learned this was no impulsive act. Roof had visited the church before, studied online maps, and posted a racist manifesto and photos with Confederate symbols. In federal court, the case moved quickly. Prosecutors charged him with 33 counts, including hate crimes and obstruction of religion. A jury found him guilty on all counts. During the sentencing phase, Roof fired his lawyers and chose to represent himself because he did not want them to argue that he was mentally ill. He told jurors that nothing was wrong with him and that he still believed in the racist ideas that drove the attack. In January of 2017, the jury sentenced him to death. Later, in state court, he pleaded guilty to avoid a second capital trial and received 9 life sentences without parole. His federal death sentence, however, stayed in place. Appeals stretched on for years. In 2021, a federal appeals court upheld his conviction and death sentence, describing his crimes as a betrayal of the civil rights movement and of humanity. The next year, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, leaving the verdict intact. Roof now sits on federal death row in Terre Haute, Indiana, waiting for the government to decide when and whether to carry out the sentence. The most unsettling piece of evidence is still the video of his own words. The day after the shooting, Roof sat in an interview room with FBI agents for nearly 2 hours, calmly walking them through what he had done. On the recording, he laughs at times, reenacts how he fired the gun, and complains that his victims complicated things by hiding under tables. When an agent asks why he did it, he answers, "I had to do it because somebody had to," then launches into a rant about black people harming whites. He talks about choosing Emmanuel because he believed it would be easy to find a small amount of black people in one area who were meek and unlikely to fight back. Number 4. Nikko Jenkins, the man who killed for a god. In August of 2013, less than a month after he walked out of prison, Nikko Jenkins moved through Omaha and left 4 people dead in just 11 days. Juan Uribe Peña and Jorge Cajiga Ruiz were found first, shot in the head, and left in a pickup truck at Spring Lake Park. A week later, Curtis Bradford was found near North 18th Street, also shot in the back of the head. 2 days after that, Andrea Kruger was dragged from her SUV and shot on a road at the edge of town. Detectives began to see patterns. Shell casings and ballistics linked scenes together. DNA tied Jenkins to the crimes. Weapons were recovered near a campsite and in abandoned vehicles. When they brought him in, the order of events he described lined up with what they already knew from the streets and the lab. When the case went to court, Jenkins chose to stand in the center of it himself. He pleaded no contest to the 4 murders and decided to represent himself, speaking directly to the judges about the killings and about his beliefs. Psychiatrists examined him. One report said he had antisocial personality disorder and accused him of exaggerating or faking psychotic symptoms, even though he talked constantly about hearing voices from gods and demons. Under Nebraska law, a panel of 3 judges, not a jury, decides whether someone gets a capital sentence. In May of 2017, that panel weighed the aggravating and mitigating factors, ruled that he was not intellectually disabled, and sentenced him to death, adding hundreds of years in extra prison time for the weapons and related charges. Portions of a long interrogation video were released later, showing Jenkins under bright lights, talking to detectives for hours about the murders and about Apophis, a serpent god from Egyptian myth. He called the shootings sacrifices and said he believed he was acting under orders from Apophis. In other records, he once cut his own face and told a guard, "Look what Apophis told me to do," then used his blood to write Apophis evil Nikko on a wall. Even after the death sentence, Jenkins kept pushing himself into public view from behind bars. He sent letters claiming responsibility for other shootings that investigators could never fully confirm. Number 3. Bobby Joe Long, the classified ad killer. Bobby Joe Long's crimes hit the Tampa Bay area fast. Over about 8 months in 1984, he killed at least 10 women. He took them from roadsides, parking lots, and apartments, then left their bodies in isolated spots outside the city. Before the killings started, police already knew his name. He had been called the classified ad rapist because he would answer ads in the paper, talk his way into women's homes by pretending to buy what they were selling, and then attack them. When women began turning up dead, fears spread quickly through Tampa and the nearby towns. The case finally broke because one victim lived. 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh was abducted at gunpoint, blindfolded, and assaulted for more than a day. Somehow, she stayed calm. She memorized everything she could, the feel of the car, the sounds around her, and left fingerprints wherever she could reach to help police later. In the end, she managed to convince Long to let her go. Her detailed report led detectives straight to his car and the area where he lived.
He guides my hands over his face. Now I'm seeing what he looks like. He's got pockmarked face, a small, clean-cut mustache, small ears, small nose, thick eyebrows, short hair. It was like I just saw him through my hands.
Within 2 weeks, officers arrested him outside a movie theater. Years later, McVeigh became a sheriff's deputy and now speaks publicly about how staying alert and observant saved her life. Those murders and assaults led to multiple convictions and a death sentence. Long pleaded guilty to a long list of kidnappings, rapes, and murders, and was sent to Florida State Prison, where he was placed on death row. He remained there for decades while the families of his victims watched the slow grind of appeals and legal reviews. In the spring of 2019, Florida's governor signed his death warrant. Relatives of the women he killed prepared to attend the execution, and Lisa McVeigh said she would be there too. During hours of interviews, Long calmly admitted to the murders in Hillsborough County and another in Pasco County, describing how he cruised for victims, what he used to bind them, and where he left their bodies. Detectives later said the most disturbing part was not just the details, but the way he delivered them. Flat, controlled, like someone going through a checklist. Forensic tests backed up what he said. Red carpet fibers from his car matched fibers found on several victims. Later, when psychologists and writers looked back at his case, they quoted him saying the murders felt like a dream until he saw them reported on television, as if even his own violence did not feel real until he watched it on the news. On May 23, 2019, the state carried out the sentence. Bobby Joe Long was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Witnesses said he made no final statement and simply closed his eyes as the procedure began. He was pronounced dead just before 7 that evening. Number 2. James Barnes, the murderer who gave up on life. James Barnes left 2 very different crime scenes behind in Florida. The first was in April of 1988, when 41-year-old nurse Patricia Patsy Miller was attacked inside her Melbourne home. Barnes came through a bedroom window, threatened her with a knife, sexually assaulted her, struck her with a hammer, tied her with shoelaces, and set her bed on fire in an attempt to erase what he had done. Miller was dead before firefighters could save her, and for years, the case remained unsolved. Almost a decade later, in December of 1997, Barnes killed again. This time, someone he knew. He strangled his estranged wife, Linda Barnes, in her West Melbourne home, despite a restraining order meant to keep him away. Deputies found him still there the next day and arrested him. In early 1998, he pleaded guilty to her murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Back in the Miller case, DNA finally caught up with him. In 1997, investigators matched Barnes's DNA to evidence from the burned bedroom. When they tried to question him, he refused to talk. The file stayed open. Years later, something changed. After converting to Islam in prison and during a period of Ramadan, Barnes wrote to prosecutors and confessed to Miller's murder, saying he wanted to clear his conscience. That admission put him on a new path, this time toward a death sentence. When the Miller case went to court, Barnes insisted on representing himself. He waived a jury, stood in front of a judge, and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, sexual battery with a weapon, burglary, and arson. In December of 2007, the judge sentenced him to death for killing Patricia Miller. In 2012, filmmaker Werner Herzog interviewed Barnes at Florida State Prison for the series On Death Row. The man on screen is quiet, polite, and precise. He sits in his cell uniform, answers questions carefully, and never once pretends he is innocent. He talks about his crimes and his conversion, and he circles back to the same idea. He is guilty, and he expects to die for it. Off camera, he sent Herzog another handwritten letter, this time claiming responsibility for 2 more unsolved murders from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Investigators took those claims seriously and reopened files, but in the end, no new charges were filed. Appeals followed Barnes's death sentence for years, but none changed the outcome. Then he made a final choice. In 2023, he fired his lawyers, waived the rest of his appeals, and told a judge he accepted his punishment and wanted the process to end. That summer, Florida's governor signed his death warrant. On August 3, 2023, James Barnes was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He turned down a special last meal, declined visitors, and offered no final statement. He was pronounced dead just after 6 in the evening. Number 1. Ted Bundy, the charming face of evil. Long before anyone called him a serial killer, Ted Bundy looked like the last person you would fear. In the mid-1970s, young women started disappearing from college campuses and city streets in places like Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. Witnesses kept describing the same kind of man: clean-cut, polite, sometimes with a fake cast or sling, asking for help carrying books or loading a sailboat. Women who agreed to help often vanished. Bundy used that act over and over. By the time investigators in different states compared notes, they realized they were dealing with the same man, moving from place to place, hunting for victims and leaving almost nothing behind. Bundy was stopped in Utah in 1975 and later linked to attempted kidnappings and disappearances there. He escaped from custody more than once, slipping through cracks in the system and moving on before trials were finished. His final spree happened after his last escape. In January of 1978, Bundy made his way to Tallahassee and slipped into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in the middle of the night. Inside, he went from room to room. In just a few minutes, he brutally attacked 4 women as they slept. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were beaten to death. 2 others survived but were badly injured. A few weeks later, in Lake City, he took 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from outside her school. Her body was later found in a wooded area on the edge of town. Bundy was finally caught in February of that year when a police officer in Pensacola pulled over a suspicious car with stolen plates. The driver gave fake names, seemed nervous, and could not explain why he had someone else's identification. Fingerprints and records confirmed it was Ted Bundy. In Florida courtrooms, Bundy tried to turn the trials into his own stage. He studied law books, questioned witnesses himself at times, and kept insisting he was innocent. But the evidence was there. Bite marks on Lisa Levy's body matched his teeth. Witnesses placed him near the Chi Omega house and tied him to Kimberly Leach. Juries convicted him for the sorority house murders and for kidnapping and killing Kimberly. Judges handed down 3 separate death sentences. That is how Bundy ended up on death row at Florida State Prison in Stark. Once those death sentences were in place and the appeals began to run out, Bundy finally started to talk more openly about what he had done. He spoke at length with writers, detectives, and a few chosen interviewers. For years, he liked to distance himself, sometimes talking about the killer as if he were describing someone else. But toward the end, he dropped that act and started using the word I. He admitted that his violent urges kept growing and described them as something he could not shut off. In one conversation, he stopped dodging the question of punishment and said, "Without a doubt, I deserve the most extreme punishment society has, and society deserves to be protected from me and others like me." A little later, he added a quieter truth. "I do not want to die. I am not going to kid you." He also tried to explain why things escalated the way they did. In his final talks with a Christian broadcaster, Bundy blamed years of consuming violent pornography, calling it the most damaging kind of pornography, and saying that mixing sex and violence had warped his fantasies. He began helping investigators, giving details about abductions in Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, and hinting at more victims than anyone could ever fully count. He described how he picked certain parking lots, watched women from a distance, and sometimes returned to scenes after the killings. A few hours after those final conversations, the clock ran out. On the morning of January 24, 1989, guards led Ted Bundy into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison and strapped him into the electric chair known as Old Sparky. Witnesses watched from behind a glass wall when the warden asked if he had any last words. Bundy turned toward his attorney, Jim Coleman, and a minister, Fred Lawrence, and said, "Jim and Fred, I would like you to give my love to my family and friends." Moments later, the current was switched on. At about 7:16 in the morning, he was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, a crowd of roughly 2,000 people had gathered before dawn. They held signs, wore homemade shirts, and cheered when they saw a white hearse roll out with his body. Later, Bundy was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in Washington's Cascade Range, back in the same part of the country where many of his victims had first disappeared. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.